The room fell silent before the gift unwrapping stopped. Not when I walked in, showing it 7 months. Not when the pink balloons spelled out Baby Girl Martinez. But when my phone buzzed and Jessica's voice carried across the living room like a dropped stone. "Wait, everyone needs to hear this," she said, her manicured fingers still hovering over her screen. "I just Googled that clinic you mentioned, Sophia. The Pacific Fertility Institute?" Her eyes widened as she read. "Do you all know what this place charges for a single vial from their premium donor program? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you." Teacups paused mid-sip. Conversations died. My sister Carmen's hand tightened around a ribbon she'd been untying from a onesie gift box. 23 women I'd known since high school, college, and my early career years all turned to look at me, their faces shifting from the polite sympathy they'd worn all afternoon to something sharper. Curiosity mixed with the first stirrings of understanding. For 2 hours, they'd been throwing me a pity party disguised as a baby shower, complete with gentle pats on the shoulder and whispered conversations about how brave I was to do this alone. The afternoon had started exactly as I'd expected. My best friend from college, Miranda, had insisted on hosting the shower at her pristine suburban home, complete with mason jar centerpieces and a dessert table that looked like it belonged in a magazine. "Every baby deserves a celebration," she'd said when she first proposed the idea, but I could hear the unspoken addition in her voice. Even babies born to women who couldn't manage to keep a man around long enough to get pregnant the traditional way. I'd arrived precisely on time, wearing a flowing navy dress that I'd chosen specifically because it didn't scream, "desperate single mother." My hair was professionally styled, my makeup carefully applied, and I carried myself with the same confidence that had gotten me through board meetings and client presentations for the past 8 years. But the moment I stepped through Miranda's front door, I felt the familiar weight of judgment settling on my shoulders like a heavy coat. The other guests were already assembled, a collection of married women and young mothers who had done things the right way. Their husbands were presumably at home watching football or taking older children to soccer games, fulfilling their roles in the traditional family structure that I had somehow failed to achieve. They greeted me with hugs that lasted a beat too long and smiles that tried too hard to mask their pity. "Sophia, you look radiant," gushed Lauren, my former sorority sister, though her eyes searched my face for signs of the desperation they all assumed must be lurking beneath the surface. "You're just glowing. Pregnancy really suits you." "Thank you," I replied evenly, settling into the chair they'd designated as the mother-to-be-throne, complete with a sash that read "Mommy-to-be" in glittery letters. The crown they'd placed on the armrest remained untouched. Some theatrical gestures were a bridge too far, even for the sake of social politeness. The gift-opening ceremony proceeded as these things always do. Tiny pink dresses and stuffed animals emerged from tissue paper, while the assembled women cooed appropriately. Each present came with a card signed by couples, their joint names, a subtle reminder of what was missing from my situation. From Mike and Jennifer. "Love, David and Ashley. Congratulations from the Thompson family." Even the single women in attendance had managed to find +1s to sign their cards, boyfriends or casual dates elevated to co-signers for the sake of not appearing as alone as I was. Between gifts, the conversations flowed in predictable directions. Birth stories from the mothers in attendance, pregnancy tips from those who'd been through it before, and carefully worded questions about my situation from those brave enough to venture into potentially uncomfortable territory. "So you're really doing this completely on your own?" asked Rachel, a pediatric nurse who'd married her high school sweetheart and produced 3 children in precise 2-year intervals. Her question was framed with concern, but I could hear the genuine bewilderment underneath. In her world, babies came from love and marriage, and careful planning between 2 committed partners. The idea of deliberately creating a child without that foundation seemed as foreign to her as planning a vacation to Mars. "I have a great support system," I answered, gesturing around the room with a smile that felt only slightly forced. "My family, my friends, my career is stable. This baby will have everything she needs." "But don't you worry about not having a father figure," pressed Linda, Miranda's neighbor who had inserted herself into the guest list despite barely knowing me. I mean, studies show that children need both parents for proper development. The room grew uncomfortable with the directness of the question, but I'd been preparing for this line of inquiry since the day I'd first walked into the fertility clinic 6 months earlier. There are plenty of single mothers raising incredible children, I said calmly, and plenty of two-parent homes that are far from ideal. I'd rather give my daughter one parent who chose her deliberately than two parents who stayed together out of obligation. It was a good answer, rehearsed but genuine, and it should have been enough to redirect the conversation. Instead, it seemed to open the floodgates for more pointed observations about my choice. "It's just so expensive, isn't it?" ventured Claire, my former coworker from my marketing days. "I saw a documentary about fertility treatments. The costs are astronomical. I can't imagine doing that without a partner to share the financial burden." "I've been saving for a while," I replied, which was true as far as it went. What I didn't mention was that my savings account had been robust enough to handle not just the fertility treatments, but also the premium donor program that had allowed me to be selective in ways that most people couldn't afford to be. "It's just so brave of you," added Sandra, Miranda's sister-in-law, her tone suggesting that bravery and foolishness were closely related concepts. "I mean, choosing to be a single mother when you could still meet someone and do this the traditional way. You're only 34. There's still time." The implication hung in the air like incense. That I had jumped the gun. That this pregnancy was the result of panic and desperation, rather than careful consideration and planning. That a woman my age should still be holding out hope for Prince Charming, rather than taking control of her own reproductive future. I'd heard variations of this theme from family members, coworkers, and casual acquaintances ever since I'd announced my pregnancy 3 months earlier. The universal assumption was that I'd settled for artificial insemination because I couldn't manage to attract and keep a suitable partner. That this baby was a consolation prize. A plan B for a woman who'd failed at the more socially acceptable plan A of marriage, followed by children. The truth was considerably more complicated, but I'd learned that people preferred simple narratives that confirmed their existing beliefs about how the world should work. A successful professional woman choosing single motherhood by design didn't fit as neatly into their understanding as a desperate spinster making the best of a bad situation. "The important thing is that you'll love this baby so much," said Patricia, Miranda's mother, her voice carrying the particular brand of condescension that older women sometimes employed when they wanted to be supportive but couldn't quite hide their disapproval. "Love makes up for a lot of other missing pieces." Missing pieces. As if my daughter would be born into a fundamentally incomplete family structure. Love serving as an inadequate bandage over a gaping wound where a father should be. I smiled and nodded and unwrapped another gift, an infant sleep.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Sack that would keep my daughter warm in the nursery I'd already prepared in my downtown condo. The nursery with the custom-built bookshelves and the organic cotton bedding and the mobile that played Chopin instead of Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. The conversation moved on to other topics. Maternity leave policies and pediatrician recommendations, and the various challenges of adjusting to life with a newborn. But underneath the practical advice and friendly chatter, I could feel the persistent current of pity that had defined the entire afternoon. These women saw me as a cautionary tale, a reminder of what could happen to a woman who focused too much on her career and waited too long to prioritize finding a husband. They didn't know about the years I'd spent in relationships that looked perfect from the outside, but felt hollow at their core. They didn't know about the fiancé who'd called off our engagement when I'd brought up the timeline for starting a family, suddenly discovering that he wasn't ready for that level of commitment. They didn't know about the successful attorney I'd dated for 2 years, who'd seemed perfect on paper, until I'd realized that his idea of partnership involved me reshaping my entire life to accommodate his established routines and preferences. They didn't know that I'd chosen single motherhood not out of desperation, but out of clarity, that I'd finally acknowledged that I wanted a child more than I wanted a husband, and that waiting for the perfect relationship might mean waiting forever, that I'd spent months researching fertility clinics and donor profiles and genetic screening because I wanted to give my daughter the best possible start in life, not because I'd given up on finding love. But explaining any of that would have required more emotional labor than I was willing to invest in an afternoon that was supposed to be celebrating my upcoming arrival, not defending my life choices. So I smiled and unwrapped gifts and accepted their pity with as much grace as I could muster, counting the minutes until I could politely extract myself from the well-meaning concern that felt more suffocating than supportive. That's when Jessica's phone had buzzed with the Google search that would transform the entire afternoon. The search that would reveal information I'd never intended to share, but that would finally give these women a glimpse into the reality of my situation rather than their assumptions about it. $35,000. Jessica read aloud, her voice climbing in disbelief. That's what they charge for a single vial from their premium donor program. And it says here that most women need multiple attempts. She looked up from her screen, her expression shifting from confusion to something approaching awe. Sophia, how much did this cost you? The room went completely silent. Even the background music Miranda had selected seemed to fade into insignificance. 23 pairs of eyes focused on me with an intensity that made the earlier pity seem gentle by comparison. This was no longer about brave single motherhood or feminist statements or making the best of a difficult situation. This was about money, and the choices that serious money could afford. The Pacific Fertility Institute isn't just any clinic, Jessica continued, her voice gaining momentum as she scrolled through more information. This is where celebrities go. Look at this, they have a whole section about their elite donor program. Advanced degrees, athletic achievements, artistic talents. The screening process alone takes 6 months. Carmen's ribbon had fallen to the floor. Forgotten. Miranda set down her teacup with a small clink that sounded enormous in the silence. I could practically see the mental calculations happening behind their eyes. The rapid reassessment of everything they thought they knew about my situation. The donors aren't just anonymous sperm contributors, Jessica read on, her fascination evident. They're selected for exceptional genetics, intelligence, and achievements. Look at this testimonial section. My daughter inherited her donor's musical ability and is already playing violin. At age 4, our son shows the same mathematical aptitude that made his donor a successful engineer. The pity that had dominated the afternoon evaporated like morning fog. In its place came something entirely different: interest, respect, and perhaps most tellingly, envy. These women who'd spent hours feeling sorry for me were beginning to realize that they might have had the situation backwards. Sophia, Miranda said carefully, her voice taking on the tone she used in her job as a real estate agent when she was trying to determine just how serious a potential buyer might be. You don't have to answer this if you don't want to, but did you really go through their premium program? I looked around the room at the faces that had been offering me sympathy all afternoon. The faces that had been treating me like a cautionary tale about the dangers of being too picky and waiting too long. The faces that belonged to women who'd married the first decent men they'd found and called it love, who'd settled into predictable suburban lives and convinced themselves that settling was the same thing as choosing. I did, I said simply. The words hung in the air like a confession, though I wasn't entirely sure what I was confessing to. To having standards? To refusing to compromise on something as important as the genetic foundation I'd give my daughter? To having the financial resources to turn reproduction into a carefully curated selection process rather than a biological lottery? Jesus, whispered Ashley, a former classmate who'd married young and spent the last decade posting social media photos of her husband's various failures at home improvement projects. That's like buying a house. That's like buying a really nice house. It was an apt comparison, though probably not in the way she'd intended. I had approached selecting my daughter's genetic contributor with the same methodical research and attention to detail that I had applied to every other major decision in my life. Medical history, educational background, physical characteristics, personality assessments, even audio interviews and childhood photos. The Pacific Fertility Institute had provided more information about their donors than most people knew about their spouses before marrying them. So your baby's father, Rachel said, then stopped herself and corrected her language. I mean, your baby's biological father, he's like exceptional? The donor I selected has a PhD in biochemistry from Stanford, I said evenly. He's published research in genomic medicine, plays classical piano, and runs marathons. Clean medical history going back 3 generations on both sides. High emotional intelligence scores on their psychological evaluations. The information landed like individual bombs in the quiet room. I could see them processing it, comparing it to their own children's fathers, measuring their husbands against a man they'd never meet but who'd been selected based on objective criteria for excellence rather than romantic compatibility or social convenience. "That's incredible," murmured Linda, though she sounded more stunned than congratulatory. "Your daughter is going to be brilliant. All babies have potential." I replied diplomatically, though privately I couldn't deny the satisfaction of seeing their assumptions crumble in real time. "I just wanted to give her the best possible genetic foundation to build from." "How did you even know about this place?" asked Claire, her professional curiosity overriding her social awkwardness. "I mean, most people who use fertility clinics are dealing with medical issues, not designing custom babies." It was a fair question, and one that got to the heart of how differently I'd approached this process than most people assumed. "I spent about 2 years researching," I said, "reading medical journals, talking to geneticists, interviewing reproductive endocrinologists. I wanted to understand all my options before making any decisions." 2 years. The number seemed to resonate with them in ways that my earlier explanations about being ready for motherhood hadn't. This wasn't an impulsive decision, made out of desperation or biological clock panic. This was a project that had required the kind of sustained research and planning that most people associated with doctoral dissertations or major business ventures. 2 years of research, repeated Patricia, Miranda's mother, her tone shifting from condescending sympathy to something approaching respect. "That's more planning than most couples put into getting married." It was an observation that cut closer to home than she probably realized. I'd seen too many of my friends rush into marriages because they'd reached an age where being single felt more uncomfortable than being with the wrong person. I'd watched smart, accomplished women convince themselves that compromise was maturity, and that lowering their standards was the same thing as being realistic about love. "So when you say you chose single motherhood," Sandra said slowly, working through the implications, "you mean you literally chose it? Like, this wasn't plan B?" "This was always plan A," I confirmed. "I've never wanted to get married just to avoid being pregnant alone. If I was going to have a child, I wanted it to be intentional, deliberate, the result of careful thought rather than accidental circumstances." The distinction seemed to reframe everything for them. The brave single mother narrative they'd been operating under was being replaced by something more complex and, frankly, more threatening to their own life choices. I wasn't a cautionary tale about the dangers of being too picky. I was an example of what was possible when you refused to settle for less than what you actually wanted. "But the cost," Ashley said, returning to the practical implications that seemed to fascinate her most. "I mean, you're talking about maybe $100,000 or more when you factor in all the procedures and medications and everything." "Investment," I corrected gently. "I prefer to think of it as an investment in my daughter's future." The word choice was deliberate. Investment implied returns, careful consideration, strategic thinking. It elevated the entire process from desperate medical intervention to sophisticated family planning. And judging by their expressions, it was a reframing that hit its mark. "God, Sophia," Miranda said, shaking her head with something that looked like admiration. "I had no idea. I mean, when you told us you were pregnant, I thought—" She trailed off, apparently reluctant to voice what she'd thought. "You thought I'd settled for artificial insemination because I couldn't manage to get pregnant the old-fashioned way." I supplied, not unkindly. "You thought this baby was a consolation prize." The accuracy of my assessment was written across their faces. That was exactly what they'd thought. That was exactly the story they'd told themselves about my situation. The narrative that had allowed them to feel sorry for me while feeling superior about their own choices. "But this is actually the opposite," Jessica said, her voice carrying a note of wonder as she continued scrolling through the clinic's website. "You didn't settle, you upgraded. You're basically giving your daughter premium genetics while the rest of us are taking whatever biological lottery our husbands happen to bring to the table." It was a blunt way to put it, but not entirely inaccurate. The genetic screening and selection process I'd gone through had eliminated risks and optimized potential in ways that natural conception never could. My daughter would be born with advantages that money could buy and love alone couldn't provide. Look at this, Carmen said, having retrieved her own phone to join the research party. They have donors who are professional musicians, Olympic athletes, published authors. Sophia, your baby's biological father could be a literal genius. He probably is, I said with a small smile. The selection criteria were pretty rigorous. The room buzzed with the kind of energy that comes when people's fundamental assumptions about the world get turned upside down. For the past 2 hours, they'd been treating my pregnancy as a brave attempt to make the best of a suboptimal situation. Now, they were beginning to understand that it might be the most strategically brilliant family planning decision any of them had ever witnessed. I have to ask, said Lauren, her former sorority sister competitiveness emerging despite the unusual circumstances. What did you tell them you were looking for? I mean, how do you even begin to shop for that? Shopping. It was another word that elevated the process from medical necessity to consumer choice. And I could see that the shift in language was helping them reconceptualize everything about my situation. I had gone shopping for my daughter's genetic foundation the same way they might shop for a house or a car, with criteria and standards and the financial resources to be selective. Intelligence was the most important factor, I said honestly. Then health, obviously. Physical characteristics that would complement mine. Emotional stability and creativity were also considerations. I didn't mention that I'd spent weeks reviewing donor profiles the way some people read novels, looking for the combination of traits that would give my daughter the best possible foundation for whatever life she chose to build. I didn't mention the spreadsheet I'd created to compare different options, or the genetic counselor I'd consulted to understand the implications of various hereditary factors. This is like something out of a science fiction movie, Rachel said, though she sounded more intrigued than disturbed. You basically designed your perfect baby. I optimized her potential. I corrected. What she does with that potential will be entirely up to her. The conversation continued for another hour, but the entire dynamic of the afternoon had shifted. The pity had evaporated, replaced by curiosity and a growing recognition that they might have misjudged both my situation and my capabilities. The women who'd been treating me like a cautionary tale were beginning to wonder if I might actually be ahead of the curve on something they'd never considered. When the party finally wound down and the last guest departed with her take-home favor bag, Miranda and I were left alone in her kitchen, loading gift bags into my car and cleaning up the detritus of an afternoon that hadn't gone according to anyone's script. I owe you an apology, Miranda said as she folded the leftover napkins with their Baby Girl Martinez inscription. I had this completely wrong. We all did. You were trying to be supportive, I replied diplomatically. I appreciate that you wanted to celebrate the baby, but we were treating you like a charity case, she said bluntly. Like you were making the best of a bad situation instead of making a deliberate choice. That was condescending as hell, and I'm sorry. It was more acknowledgement than I'd expected, and more honest than most people would have been willing to be. The assumptions are understandable, I said. Most people don't think of single motherhood as an optimal choice. But for you it was, she said, making it a statement rather than a question. This really was what you wanted all along. This really was what I wanted all along. I confirmed. We finished loading the car in comfortable silence, both of us processing an afternoon that had revealed more than either of us had anticipated. As I drove home to my condo with its prepared nursery and carefully selected baby furniture, I reflected on the strange satisfaction of watching people's assumptions crumble in real time. For months, I'd endured well-meaning pity and gentle condescension from people who saw my pregnancy as evidence of either desperation or poor life planning. I'd smiled through conversations about making the best of things and love being enough, and brave choices in difficult circumstances. I'd let people project their own fears about aging and singleness onto my situation because correcting them seemed like more effort than it was worth. But Jessica's Google search had done what months of patient explanation couldn't accomplish. It had revealed that my choice wasn't about settling for less, but about refusing to accept anything other than exactly what I wanted. It had shown them that single motherhood could be a position of strength rather than compromise, and that having the resources to be truly selective was a luxury that most people never experienced. My daughter would be born into a world where she was deliberately chosen and carefully planned for, not accidentally conceived or begrudgingly accepted. She would inherit genetic advantages that money could buy and love alone couldn't provide. Most importantly, she would grow up knowing that her existence was the result of intention and careful thought, not biological accident or romantic compromise. The women at the baby shower had spent the afternoon feeling sorry for me because they assumed I'd failed to achieve what they considered the ideal family structure. By the end of the afternoon, some of them were probably wondering if they'd been the ones who'd settled for less than optimal circumstances. If their children's genetic foundation had been left to chance when it could have been carefully curated. If their rush to achieve social milestones had prevented them from considering alternatives that might have served their families better. I pulled into my parking garage and gathered the gift bags that represented hours of thoughtful shopping by women who were still processing the revelation that my approach to motherhood had been more strategic and resource-intensive than their own. Tomorrow, I would write thank you notes and prepare for the final weeks of pregnancy. I would continue with the prenatal yoga classes and the Bradley Method childbirth preparation that would help me bring my deliberately chosen daughter into the world. But tonight, I would simply rest in the satisfaction of an afternoon that had finally revealed the truth about my situation to people who'd spent months misunderstanding it entirely. They'd come to pity the single mother and discovered instead a woman who'd approached the creation of life with the same strategic thinking and resource allocation that had made her successful in every other area of her existence. It wasn't the baby shower I'd expected, but it was exactly the revelation I'd been waiting for someone else to have. The journey to that moment of revelation hadn't begun with fertility clinics or donor catalogs. It had started 3 years earlier in a corner office overlooking downtown Seattle, where I sat across from my financial advisor reviewing investment portfolios and retirement projections. At 31, I was already earning more than most people would see in their peak earning years, and my carefully diversified portfolio was growing at a rate that would ensure comfortable independence well into old age. "You're in an enviable position, Sophia," David Chen had said, sliding the quarterly reports across his mahogany desk. "Most people your age are still paying off student loans and scraping together down payments for their first homes. You're looking at genuine wealth accumulation." The numbers were impressive, even to me. My marketing consulting firm had grown from a one-woman operation working out of my apartment to a boutique agency with 12 employees and clients that included Fortune 500 companies. The success had come faster than I'd anticipated, and required sacrifices I hadn't fully calculated when I'd first struck out on my own after leaving the corporate world at 27. "The question is," David continued, "what are your long-term goals? Are you planning to expand the business further, or are there personal milestones you're working toward?" Personal milestones. The phrase hung in the air between us like a challenge. Most of my peers were checking off the traditional boxes by this point in their lives. Marriage, house in the suburbs. First child by 33, second child by 35. I'd watched friends disappear into domestic routines that seemed to consume their identities, along with their time and disposable income. "I've been thinking about having children," I said carefully, testing the words in the professional environment where I was most comfortable discussing major life decisions. "But I'm not sure about the traditional timeline for that." David nodded with the practiced neutrality of someone who'd had similar conversations with successful women before. "Children are expensive," he said pragmatically, "but you're certainly in a position to afford them. Private schools, college funds, extracurricular activities. You could provide advantages that most families can't." It was a clinical way to discuss reproduction, but it matched my mindset at the time. I'd spent my entire adult life approaching major decisions through the lens of cost-benefit analysis and strategic planning. Career moves, investment choices, even relationships had been evaluated based on their potential returns and opportunity costs. Why should starting a family be any different? "The challenge," I said, "is that I'm not currently in a relationship, and I'm not sure I want to wait for one to materialize before making this decision." The admission felt simultaneously liberating and terrifying. I'd been dancing around the idea for months, but saying it aloud to someone else made it real, in a way that private contemplation never could. I was considering deliberately choosing single motherhood, not as a fallback option, but as a preferred strategy. There are certainly more options available now than there used to be, David said diplomatically. Fertility preservation, assisted reproduction, alternative family structures. Have you done any preliminary research? I had, though not in the systematic way that would later characterize my approach. I'd read articles about career women freezing their eggs, about the growing acceptance of single motherhood by choice, about the technological advances that made conception possible without traditional romantic relationships. But I hadn't yet committed to treating it as a serious project rather than idle speculation about potential futures. Some, I replied, but I think I need to approach this more methodically. If I'm going to do this, I want to do it right. That conversation marked the beginning of what would become the most intensive research project of my life. I approached the question of single motherhood the same way I approached everything else that mattered, with systematic analysis and careful attention to detail. But unlike business decisions or investment strategies, this research quickly revealed just how little I understood about the world of assisted reproduction and the choices it made possible. My first step was medical consultation. I scheduled comprehensive fertility testing with Dr. Sarah Williams, a reproductive endocrinologist who came highly recommended by my gynecologist. The appointment was scheduled for 2 hours, which seemed excessive until I realized how many factors needed to be evaluated and discussed. You're fortunate to be thinking about this now, Dr. Williams said as she reviewed my test results. Your egg quality and quantity are excellent for your age, and you have no indicators of reproductive issues that would complicate conception. If you decide to proceed with assisted reproduction, you'd be an ideal candidate. The clinical language made the entire process sound like applying for a loan or qualifying for a mortgage. There were criteria to meet, boxes to check, standards to satisfy. It was comforting in its objectivity, so different from the emotional complexity that seemed to surround traditional conception and family planning. What are my options? I asked, pulling out the notebook I'd brought to document everything. This was information gathering, and I intended to be thorough. Dr. Williams walked me through the various approaches to assisted reproduction, from intrauterine insemination with donor sperm to in vitro fertilization with various levels of genetic screening and selection. The menu of choices was broader than I'd realized, and the technology more sophisticated than I'd imagined. The basic approach is fairly straightforward, she explained. We can use frozen donor sperm for insemination, either with your natural cycle or with mild hormonal stimulation to optimize timing. Success rates for women your age are good, though it may take several attempts. What about more advanced options? I asked. I've read about genetic screening and selection processes. Dr. Williams' expression shifted slightly, becoming more attentive. There are certainly more comprehensive approaches available, though they're significantly more expensive and complex. Some clinics offer extensive donor screening and genetic testing that goes well beyond basic medical history. She mentioned the Pacific Fertility Institute almost casually, as an example of the high-end reproductive services that were becoming increasingly popular among women with substantial financial resources. They offer what they call comprehensive family planning, which includes detailed donor profiles, genetic optimization, and advanced screening processes. But we're talking about a very different price point and level of involvement. The Pacific Fertility Institute. I wrote down the name and made a note to research them thoroughly. If I was going to do this, I wanted to understand all my options, regardless of cost. Money wasn't a limiting factor in this decision, and I had no interest in making compromises based on financial constraints. My second research phase involved diving deep into the science of genetics and heredity. I spent weeks reading peer-reviewed articles about inherited traits, genetic predispositions, and the factors that influence child development. I consulted with geneticists and developmental psychologists, asking questions that probably seemed excessive to people accustomed to patients who left such matters to chance and nature. Most parents don't have the opportunity to make informed decisions about their children's genetic foundation, explained Dr. Margaret Foster, a geneticist at the University of Washington who agreed to meet with me for a consultation. Natural reproduction is essentially a lottery system. Advanced donor selection allows for optimization in ways that weren't possible even a decade ago. The conversation was fascinating and slightly unsettling. Dr. Foster showed me research about the heritability of various traits, from intelligence and athleticism to personality characteristics and artistic abilities. The idea that I could influence my future child's potential through careful donor selection was both empowering and overwhelming. What would you consider the most important factors to optimize for? I asked, genuinely curious about her professional perspective. Intelligence is highly heritable and influences virtually every aspect of life outcomes, she said without hesitation. Health is obviously crucial, though modern genetic screening can eliminate most serious hereditary conditions. Beyond that, it depends on your personal values and what you hope for your child's future. Personal values. That was the crux of the decision, wasn't it? What did I value most highly? And how could those values inform the choice I made about my child's genetic foundation? I'd spent my entire adult life believing that hard work and determination could overcome almost any obstacle, but genetics research suggested that some advantages were built in, rather than earned. My third research phase involved investigating the Pacific Fertility Institute directly. Their website was sophisticated and comprehensive, more like a luxury service provider than a medical clinic. The language emphasized choice, optimization, and excellence, rather than simply treating infertility or reproductive challenges. We believe that every child deserves the best possible genetic foundation, their mission statement read. Our comprehensive donor selection and screening processes ensure that families have access to exceptional genetic material combined with detailed health and background information. Exceptional genetic material. The phrasing was clinical yet aspirational, suggesting that reproduction could be elevated from biological necessity to strategic family planning. I found myself spending hours reviewing their donor database, which read more like a catalog of human excellence than a medical directory. The donors weren't just anonymous sperm contributors. They were accomplished individuals whose achievements and characteristics were documented in remarkable detail. Advanced degrees from prestigious universities, athletic accomplishments, artistic talents, psychological evaluations, and even audio interviews that provided insights into personality and communication style. I found myself comparing the donor profiles to the men I'd dated over the years, and the comparison wasn't flattering to my romantic history. The attorney who'd seemed so impressive with his law degree from a good school paled in comparison to donors with PhDs from Harvard and Stanford. The amateur triathlete I'd briefly dated couldn't compete with Olympic-level athletes whose genetic gifts were available for consideration. It was a jarring realization that the traditional path to parenthood had never offered me anything approaching this level of selection and optimization. Marriage had always been presented as the responsible precursor to children. But marriage was fundamentally about emotional compatibility and romantic attraction, not genetic optimization or strategic family planning. The more I learned about the Pacific Fertility Institute's processes, the more convinced I became that this approach might be superior to traditional conception in every measurable way. The genetic screening eliminated hereditary diseases and predispositions that could compromise my child's health and development. The psychological evaluations ensured emotional stability and positive personality characteristics. The intellectual and achievement criteria optimized for potential that money couldn't buy after conception. You're basically talking about designing your ideal child, my sister Carmen said when I finally shared my research with her over dinner at our favorite restaurant. This is like something out of a movie. I'm talking about giving my child the best possible genetic foundation, I corrected. What's wrong with that? Carmen stirred her wine thoughtfully, processing the implications of what I was describing. It's just so calculated, she said finally. So scientific. Don't you want some mystery, some surprise in the process? I want my child to be healthy, intelligent, and emotionally stable, I replied. If I can influence those outcomes through careful selection, why wouldn't I? It was a conversation we would have many times over the following months. As I continued researching and she continued processing the idea that her sister was approaching reproduction like a business decision. Carmen had married her college boyfriend and was trying to conceive naturally, leaving their future children's genetics to chance and biology. She seemed genuinely disturbed by the level of control and selection I was contemplating. But what if you meet someone? She asked repeatedly. What if you fall in love and want to have children the normal way? The normal way. As if there was something abnormal about choosing to optimize my child's genetic foundation rather than leaving it to romantic happenstance. As if intentional selection was somehow less valid than accidental conception. with whoever happened to be sharing my bed at the moment of biological readiness. If I meet someone who's genetically superior to the donors I'm considering, and if we have a relationship that would provide better emotional stability than I can offer alone, then I'll reconsider, I said pragmatically. But I'm not going to postpone having a child based on hypothetical future relationships that may never materialize. The fourth phase of my research involved visiting the Pacific Fertility Institute directly. Their offices occupied an entire floor of a modern medical building in downtown Portland, and the environment felt more like a high-end hotel than a clinical facility. The waiting room featured original artwork, comfortable seating, and a view of the mountains that suggested both luxury and success. We work exclusively with women who view family planning as a strategic decision, explained Dr. Girl Martinez, the clinic's director and lead reproductive endocrinologist. Our client's generation of parents had ever possessed. My final selection was donor 847. A 34-year-old biochemist with a PhD from Stanford, published research in genomic medicine, and a background that suggested both intellectual brilliance and emotional stability. He was a classical pianist who ran marathons, spoke 3 languages, and had volunteered with disadvantaged children throughout graduate school. His psychological evaluation indicated high empathy, strong communication skills, and leadership potential. Most importantly, his genetic screening showed no predisposition to hereditary diseases, optimal markers for intelligence and creativity, and physical characteristics that would complement my own genetic contributions. According to the predictive modeling that the clinic provided, our combined genetics would likely produce a child with above-average intelligence, excellent health, and strong potential for achievement in academic or creative pursuits. Excellent choice, Dr. Martinez said when I submitted my selection paperwork. Donor 847 is one of our most requested contributors. You're giving your daughter tremendous genetic advantages. Genetic advantages. The phrase encapsulated everything I was trying to accomplish through this process. I wasn't just having a baby, I was launching a human being with the best possible foundation for whatever life she chose to build. The advantages I could provide through careful genetic selection were permanent and profound in ways that money alone could never replicate. The actual conception process was anticlimactic compared to the months of research and selection that had preceded it. 3 visits to the clinic, hormone monitoring to optimize timing, and a procedure that took less than 30 minutes. The clinical efficiency of assisted reproduction was jarring after the emotional intensity of donor selection, but it suited my preference for straightforward processes and measurable outcomes. 2 weeks later, the pregnancy test came back positive. I was going to be a mother, and my daughter was going to inherit genetic advantages that money could buy but love alone could never provide. The satisfaction was profound and complicated, mixing joy about impending motherhood with vindication about the strategic approach I'd chosen. The early months of pregnancy proceeded smoothly, confirming that the genetic screening and medical evaluations had been thorough and accurate. My daughter's development met or exceeded every benchmark, and the prenatal testing showed no concerns or complications. I was carrying a healthy baby whose genetic foundation had been carefully optimized rather than left to chance. But the social implications of my choice became apparent almost immediately. When I announced my pregnancy to friends and family, the universal assumption was that I'd settled for single motherhood, because I'd failed to find a suitable partner. The idea that I might have chosen this approach deliberately, as a superior alternative to traditional conception, was literally incomprehensible to most people. "I'm sure you'll meet someone wonderful, who'll want to be a father to the baby," my mother said repeatedly, unable to accept that I might genuinely prefer single motherhood to the complications and compromises of romantic relationships. It's never too late to find love. Find love. As if love was a prerequisite for good parenting or genetic optimization. As if the emotional satisfaction of romantic partnership was more important than the scientific advantages I'd provided for my child through careful selection and screening. The conversations were exhausting and fundamentally missed the point of what I'd accomplished. My professional life continued without interruption during pregnancy, partly because running my own company provided flexibility that traditional employment never could, and partly because I'd structured my business to operate efficiently without requiring constant personal oversight. The financial resources that had made premium fertility treatment possible also insulated me from the tend-to-be accomplished professionals who bring the same level of analysis and planning to parenthood that they apply to other major life decisions. Dr. Martinez was perhaps 45, impeccably dressed, and spoke with the confidence of someone who'd guided hundreds of women through the process I was contemplating. During our initial consultation, she reviewed my medical history, financial information, and personal preferences with the thoroughness of a private banker or luxury real estate agent. "Your profile suggests that you'd be an excellent candidate for our comprehensive program," she said after reviewing my file. "You have the resources to be selective, the health to proceed without complications, and the decision-making framework to take full advantage of our selection and screening processes." The comprehensive program was exactly what it sounded like. Detailed review of donor profiles including genetic screening, health history, psychological evaluations, and personal background information. Multiple rounds of interviews and assessments to ensure optimal matching based on my criteria and preferences. Advanced fertility treatments designed to maximize the chances of conception and healthy pregnancy. "What kind of criteria do clients typically use for donor selection?" I asked, genuinely curious about how other women approach this decision. "Intelligence and health are universal priorities," Dr. Martinez replied. "Beyond that, it varies considerably. Some clients prioritize physical characteristics, others focus on artistic or athletic abilities. Many are interested in educational achievement and professional success. The key is identifying what matters most to you and your vision for your child's future." My vision for my child's future. It was a phrase that reframed the entire process from medical procedure to long-term strategic planning. What kind of advantages did I want to provide? What characteristics would serve my daughter best in the world she'd inherit? What genetic gifts could I give her that money alone couldn't buy after birth? "I'd like to review the available donors," I said, making the decision that would commit me to this path. "I want to understand the full range of options before making any selections." Dr. Martinez smiled with the satisfaction of someone who'd successfully guided another client through the decision-making process. "I think you'll be impressed by the quality of our donor pool," she said. "These are truly exceptional individuals who've chosen to contribute to our program because they want to help create the next generation of exceptional children." The next generation of exceptional children. It was an aspirational vision that appealed to everything I valued about planning, preparation, and strategic thinking. My child wouldn't be the product of biological accident or romantic convenience. She would be deliberately chosen, carefully planned, and genetically optimized for success in whatever path she eventually chose to pursue. The donor selection process took 3 months of careful review and analysis. The Pacific Fertility Institute's database included more than 200 active donors, each with comprehensive profiles that read like resumes for genetic excellence. Advanced degrees, professional achievements, athletic accomplishments, artistic talents, psychological stability, and detailed health information going back multiple generations. I approached the selection with the same systematic analysis I brought to every major decision. I created spreadsheets comparing different donors across multiple criteria, weighted the various factors based on their importance to my child's future, and consulted with geneticists and child development specialists about the likely outcomes of different combinations. The process was simultaneously fascinating and overwhelming. I was essentially choosing my child's genetic foundation from a menu of human excellence, selecting characteristics and potentials that would influence every aspect of her development and future possibilities. It was a level of control and optimization that no previous. What Mark and I are leaving to chance with natural conception. Are we being irresponsible by not investing in better genetics for our future children? It was a question that more of my friends and family members were asking themselves since the baby shower revelation. The women who'd spent that afternoon feeling sorry for my single status were now questioning whether they'd been too quick to accept biological lottery systems when strategic selection was available to those willing to invest in it. Miranda had called twice since the party, ostensibly to check on my health but really to ask more detailed questions about the donor selection process and genetic optimization services. "I'm not saying I would make the same choice," she'd said carefully. But I'm wondering if we should have done more research before trying to conceive naturally. What if we're missing opportunities to give our children better foundations? The questions revealed how profoundly the Google search revelation had disrupted their understanding of optimal family planning. For most people, reproduction was something that happened to them rather than something they strategically managed. The idea that genetic advantages could be purchased and optimized was literally foreign to their experience and assumptions about how families were supposed to be created. But for me, it had always been obvious that important decisions should be made with complete information and adequate resources. I approached business opportunities the same way, evaluating options systematically and investing in the alternatives that offered the best long-term returns. Why would creating a human being deserve less careful analysis and strategic planning than choosing a stock portfolio or acquiring commercial real estate? 2 days later, labor began during a client conference call that I was conducting from my home office. The contractions were precise and regular, arriving exactly when the medical projections had suggested they would. Even my daughter's birth timing reflected the optimization and careful planning that had characterized every aspect of her creation and development. I need to reschedule this call, I told my clients with professional calm, despite the intensity of the physical sensations I was experiencing. I'm going into labor, and I need to head to the hospital. The delivery process proceeded smoothly and efficiently, another confirmation that the genetic screening and medical care I'd invested in had been comprehensive and accurate. My daughter emerged healthy, alert, and already showing signs of the intelligence and physical development that the genetic predictions had suggested. "She's beautiful," Dr. Reeves said, placing my daughter on my chest for immediate skin-to-skin contact. "And look at those eyes. She's already tracking movement and responding to voices. That's advanced development for a newborn." Advanced development. The phrase filled me with a satisfaction that went beyond typical maternal pride. This wasn't just love for my child, it was validation of the strategic choices I'd made throughout the pregnancy and conception process. My daughter was already demonstrating the genetic advantages that careful selection had provided. Sophia Martinez weighed 7 pounds and 4 ounces, with dark hair that matched mine and eyes that would eventually settle into the hazel color that her donor's genetic profile had predicted. But more importantly, she displayed the alertness, physical coordination, and responsive behavior that indicated optimal neurological development and genetic health. Her APGAR scores are perfect, the pediatric nurse reported, documenting the standard measurements of newborn health and development. Reflexes are strong, muscle tone is excellent, and her responses to stimuli are well above average for gestational age. Well above average. I'd invested in genetic optimization specifically to ensure that my daughter would have advantages that money could buy, but chance alone couldn't provide. The early indicators suggested that those investments were economic pressures that forced many women to choose between career advancement and family planning. "You're glowing," clients would say during video conferences, noting the obvious signs of pregnancy without asking direct questions about my personal situation. The business world was more comfortable with professional boundaries than my social circle, and my pregnancy was treated as private information that didn't require explanation or justification. But privately, I was already planning the advantages I would provide for my daughter beyond genetic optimization. The nursery in my downtown condo was designed to stimulate intellectual development from birth. Black and white patterns for early visual development, classical music for neural pathway formation, carefully selected books and toys that would encourage curiosity and creativity. I enrolled in prenatal classes focused on early childhood development, consulted with pediatric specialists about optimal nutrition and stimulation, and researched educational approaches that would maximize my daughter's intellectual and creative potential. The same systematic planning that had guided my donor selection was now being applied to every aspect of her early environment and development. "You're approaching this like a scientific experiment," Carmen observed during one of our regular dinner conversations. "Don't you want to just enjoy being pregnant and let some things happen naturally?" Naturally. There was that word again, suggesting that careful planning and optimization were somehow less valid than leaving important outcomes to chance and biology. I'd chosen to give my daughter every possible advantage through genetic selection, and I intended to continue providing advantages through careful attention to her developmental environment and educational opportunities. I want to give her the best possible start in life, I replied. If that means being systematic about pregnancy, child development, and education, then that's what I'll do. By the 7th month of pregnancy, I was confident that I'd made the right decision. My daughter was developing perfectly. I was financially prepared for single motherhood, and I'd created a support system that didn't depend on romantic relationships or traditional family structures. The genetic advantages I'd provided through donor selection were already apparent in her development, and the environmental advantages I was preparing would optimize her potential from birth. The baby shower that Miranda organized was intended to celebrate my impending motherhood, but it revealed just how profoundly my friends and family had misunderstood both my situation and my approach to parenthood. Their pity was based on assumptions about compromise and settling that had nothing to do with the strategic choices I'd actually made. When Jessica's Google search exposed the reality of what I'd invested in my daughter's genetic foundation, their assumptions crumbled in real time. The brave single mother they'd been patronizing was revealed to be a woman who'd approached family planning with more resources, more information, and more strategic thinking than any of them had brought to their own reproductive decisions. The revelation was satisfying in ways I hadn't anticipated. For months, I'd endured well-meaning sympathy from people who saw my pregnancy as evidence of desperation or poor planning. The truth was exactly the opposite. I'd approached motherhood with the same careful analysis and resource allocation that had made me successful in business, and the results were superior to what traditional conception and romantic relationships could have provided. My daughter would inherit genetic advantages that money could buy, but love alone never could. She would grow up in an environment optimized for intellectual and creative development, supported by financial resources that most families never possessed, and raised by a mother who'd chosen her deliberately rather than accepting her accidentally. The pity party disguised as a baby shower had revealed more about my assumptions and limitations than about my situation. They'd spent the afternoon feeling sorry for a woman who'd actually made more strategic and resource-intensive choices about family planning than any of them had ever contemplated. Tomorrow, I would continue preparing for my daughter's arrival, confident that I'd given her advantages that extended far beyond what traditional families typically provided. The genetic optimization was just the beginning of a comprehensive approach to parenting that would serve her throughout her life. I had chosen not to settle for anything less than exceptional, and the results would speak for themselves in the years to come. 3 weeks after the baby shower revelation, I was sitting in my obstetrician's office for what would be my final prenatal appointment before delivery. Dr. Patricia Reeves had been monitoring my pregnancy since the first trimester, and her professional demeanor had gradually warmed into genuine admiration for how thoroughly I'd prepared for every aspect of impending motherhood. "Your daughter is perfectly positioned and showing excellent signs of development," she said, reviewing the ultrasound images on her computer screen. "All indicators suggest you're looking at a very healthy, very intelligent baby. The genetic screening and optimization you invested in appears to have been worth every penny." Worth every penny. The phrase would have sounded crass coming from anyone else, but Dr. Reeves had worked with enough high-achieving women to understand that strategic family planning was becoming increasingly common among those who had the resources to pursue it. She'd seen the difference that careful genetic selection could make in terms of pregnancy outcomes and child development. "I've been thinking about the delivery," I said, pulling out my tablet where I'd been documenting questions and concerns. "I want to make sure we're optimizing every aspect of her transition into the world." Dr. Reeves smiled at my characteristic attention to detail. "You've prepared more thoroughly than any patient I've ever worked with. The birth plan you've developed is comprehensive and thoughtful. Your daughter is going to have an ideal entry into the world." The birth plan in question was the result of months of research into optimal delivery conditions, immediate newborn care protocols, and evidence-based practices for supporting infant development from the moment of birth. I'd consulted with pediatric specialists, reviewed medical literature, and interviewed other mothers who'd taken similarly systematic approaches to childbirth and early childcare. Dr. Martinez from the Pacific Fertility Institute mentioned that donor-conceived children often show accelerated development in their first year. I said, Should I expect anything different from naturally conceived babies? The genetic advantages you've provided may indeed manifest as advanced development, Dr. Reeves confirmed. Enhanced cognitive development, stronger physical coordination, improved immune system function. The comprehensive screening and selection process you went through was designed to optimize for exactly those outcomes. Enhanced cognitive development. The phrase sent a thrill through me that had nothing to do with maternal instinct and everything to do with strategic satisfaction. I'd invested significant resources in giving my daughter genetic advantages that would serve her throughout her life, and the early indicators suggested that those investments were already paying dividends. My phone buzzed with a text message from Carmen asking if I needed anything before heading to the hospital. Since the baby shower, my sister's attitude toward my choices had shifted from concerned disapproval to something approaching awe. The revelation about the Pacific Fertility Institute had forced her to reconsider not just my approach to single motherhood, but her own assumptions about optimal family planning. "I keep thinking about what you spent on genetic optimization," she'd said during our most recent conversation, "and comparing it to already manifesting in measurable ways." Carmen arrived at the hospital within 2 hours of Elena's birth, carrying flowers and wearing an expression that mixed joy with barely concealed amazement. She'd been processing the implications of my genetic optimization choices for weeks, and seeing my daughter's advanced development in person seemed to crystallize her understanding of what I'd accomplished. "She's incredible, Sophia," she said softly, watching Elena track her movements with eyes that seemed impossibly alert for a newborn. "I can already tell she's different from other babies I've seen. More aware, more responsive. The genetic selection really worked." The genetic selection really worked. It was acknowledgement that my systematic approach to family planning had produced measurable results that were already apparent in my daughter's first hours of life. Carmen had spent months questioning my choices, but Elena's obvious advantages were impossible to dismiss or attribute to wishful thinking. "She inherited the best genetics that money could buy," I said simply. "Intelligence, health, physical coordination, emotional stability. Those advantages will serve her throughout her life." Over the following days, hospital staff repeatedly commented on Elena's unusual alertness and advanced responses to stimuli. Pediatric specialists who examined her noted developmental markers that typically appeared weeks later in average newborns. The genetic optimization that had guided my donor selection was already manifesting in ways that medical professionals found remarkable. "I've been working with newborns for 15 years, said Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the pediatrician who would be managing Elena's ongoing care. "Your daughter is displaying cognitive and physical development that's genuinely exceptional for her age. The genetic advantages you provided through donor selection are already apparent." Genetic advantages that were already apparent. The validation was profound and multifaceted. I hadn't just succeeded in becoming a mother. I'd succeeded in providing my daughter with measurable advantages that would influence every aspect of her future development and potential achievements. When we returned home from the hospital, Elena adapted to her new environment with the same advanced responsiveness that had impressed medical professionals. She established regular sleep patterns quickly, demonstrated strong feeding reflexes, and showed visual and auditory tracking abilities that exceeded typical developmental timelines. The nursery I'd prepared with evidence-based attention to optimal infant stimulation seemed perfectly suited to her advanced capabilities. The black and white patterns designed to support early visual development held her attention for longer periods than typical newborn attention spans. The classical music I played during feeding and sleeping times seemed to soothe her in ways that suggested enhanced auditory processing. Most significantly, Elena's crying patterns were remarkably controlled and communicative, suggesting the emotional stability and intelligence that her donor's psychological evaluations had predicted. She wasn't just responding to basic needs and discomforts. She was already demonstrating problem-solving behaviors and adaptive responses to environmental changes. Miranda visited when Elena was 2 weeks old, bringing a gift bag filled with organic baby clothes, and an expression that revealed how profoundly her perspective on family planning had shifted since the baby shower revelation. She spent an hour observing Elena's interactions and responses, clearly comparing my daughter's development to her own children's early infancy. "It's like she's already thinking," Miranda said as Elena tracked her movements across the room with focused attention. My kids were barely aware of their surroundings at this age, but she's watching everything, processing information, responding to stimuli. The difference is remarkable. The difference was exactly what I'd invested in achieving through genetic optimization and systematic selection. Elena wasn't just a healthy baby, she was a genetically advantaged baby whose foundation for future learning and development had been carefully curated rather than left to biological chance. This is what premium genetics looks like, I said with quiet satisfaction. Intelligence, health, and emotional stability that money can buy but luck alone rarely provides. Over the following months, Elena's advanced development continued to exceed every benchmark and timeline. She smiled earlier than average, reached physical milestones ahead of schedule, and demonstrated cognitive abilities that pediatric specialists found consistently impressive. The genetic advantages I'd provided through careful donor selection were manifesting as measurable superiority in every area of development. At her 6-month pediatric appointment, Dr. Walsh documented developmental achievements that placed Elena in the top percentiles for intelligence, physical coordination, and social responsiveness. She's not just meeting milestones early, the pediatrician explained. She's demonstrating capabilities that suggest exceptional potential for future learning and achievement. Exceptional potential for future learning and achievement. The phrase encapsulated everything I'd hoped to accomplish through strategic family planning and genetic optimization. Elena wasn't just my daughter. She was proof that careful selection and adequate resources could provide advantages that traditional conception and romantic relationships rarely delivered. The women from the baby shower who'd initially pitied my single status began requesting advice about fertility optimization and genetic selection services. The revelation about Elena's advanced development had forced them to reconsider their assumptions about optimal family planning and the advantages that strategic thinking could provide. I keep thinking about what you achieved, Jessica said during a coffee meeting when Elena was 8 months old. You didn't just have a baby, you designed a superior human being. The rest of us left our children's genetics to chance when we could have invested in optimization. Superior human being. The language was dramatic, but the observation was accurate. Elena's development continued to demonstrate advantages that genetic screening and careful donor selection had provided. She was healthier, more intelligent, and more emotionally stable than statistical averages suggested was typical for her age group. As Elena approached her first birthday, her advanced development was impossible to ignore or attribute to exceptional parenting alone. She was speaking earlier than average, demonstrating problem-solving abilities that suggested enhanced cognitive function, and showing physical coordination that exceeded typical developmental timelines. She's going to have opportunities that most children never access, I reflected while watching Elena manipulate complex toys with dexterity that impressed visiting friends and family members. The genetic advantages I provided will serve her throughout her education, career, and personal relationships. The strategic approach to family planning that had initially generated pity and concern had produced measurable results that vindicated every choice I'd made. Elena wasn't just proof that single motherhood could be successful. She was evidence that systematic selection and genetic optimization could provide advantages that traditional families rarely achieved. The baby shower that had begun with condescending sympathy had revealed the truth about strategic family planning to women who'd never considered alternatives to biological lottery systems and romantic relationships. But Elena herself was the ultimate validation, a living demonstration that careful choices and adequate resources could optimize human potential from the moment of conception. I'd chosen to give my daughter advantages that money could buy but love alone never provided. The results spoke for themselves in every milestone she achieved, every capability she demonstrated, and every sign of the Frechaya, exceptional potential that genetic optimization had made possible. The women who'd pitied my single status had missed the point entirely. I hadn't settled for less than optimal circumstances. I'd invested in providing my daughter with genetic advantages that traditional conception rarely delivered. Elena's first birthday party was attended by many of the same women who'd gathered for my baby shower 18 months earlier. But instead of offering sympathy for my single motherhood, They were asking detailed questions about genetic optimization services and premium fertility programs. The revelation about my strategic approach to family planning had transformed their understanding of what was possible when adequate resources met systematic planning. The pity party had become a consultation session, and the women who'd initially felt sorry for me were now wondering if they'd been too quick to accept biological chance, when genetic advantages were available to those willing to invest in them. Elena's obvious superiority had vindicated every choice I'd made and revealed the limitations of their own assumptions about optimal family planning. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.